From the Psych Hub Podcast Network, welcome to Coming Back Better, a podcast sponsored by HCA Healthcare and in collaboration with Columbia University Department of Psychiatry.
Hi, I'm Paul Deger, the Clinical Director at Psych Hub, and welcome to our first episode of Coming Back Better, a new podcast series on understanding the impacts COVID had on our mental health and wellness, and how we can truly come back better. With COVID, we've been through a lot, and we're so focused on getting back to normal, but maybe normal wasn't all that great to begin with. In order to not only move forward, but really grow, it's important to take a second and reflect on what happened.
Wuhan, ground zero for this mysterious virus.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
New CDC guidelines recommending the wearing of masks.
Not to mention the emotional toll it's taking on a nervous nation.
The first vaccinations are now underway across the U.S.
It's time to learn how to live with the virus.
Hi, I'm Marjorie Morrison, CEO and co-founder of Psych Hub. We are so excited to be on this journey with you and to explore how the pandemic transformed our lives and our communities. We recognize there were a lot of challenges during that time, but that also offered us the opportunity to grow. And we want to focus on the lessons we learned and how to truly come back better. Whether it was tackling mental health head on, spending more time with family, or improving our habits, we all gained insight into ourselves and to others. In this series, Paul and I are going to hear from people like you. We're going to hear about their experiences, as well as talk to leading psychologists and researchers. Paul, I thought I'd start us off with something Dr. Frank Drummond, the National Medical Director of Behavioral Health Services at HCA Healthcare, talked about, which was really emphasizing what we learned during the pandemic and how we could use it to be helpful in the way forward.
Wow, this sounds like a good place to kick things off. Thanks, Marjorie. Let's take a listen.
Everyone globally, and I can't emphasize that enough, had an experience where they had to consider their own physical health and others' physical health, their own mental wellness or well-being, and that of those around them, including their children, their loved ones, coworkers. Some sort of trauma or loss. Everyone lost something, and everyone had some experience with the impact of gratitude in their life. What do we do with that information now? Do we say we're done with it and put it behind us? Oh, I'm so glad I don't have to wear masks anymore. I'm going to fly around everywhere. Or do we actually take that and integrate it and use it for the rest of our lives? Given that we know that some sense of security and safety might not be the same anymore for the rest of our lives. And number two, maybe you learned a lot about yourself and others that could be useful in the way you go forward.
Wow, Marjorie, listening to Dr. Drummond, I think really helps to set a tone for how important this series is going to be and all the different topics that we're going to be covering, all the different nuances and different ways that we lived through the past couple of years. And for today, our first topic is going to be taking a look at the lives of families with small children. Now, I know some folks are saying, yeah, I lived through that. Why do I want to hear about that again? Or maybe you're like me and you've got a 20-year-old at home and young children seem so far away from your direct experience. But having listened to some of these stories, I think we can all take something away.
One of the biggest disruptions, schools from kindergarten to college closing their doors. Parents nationwide now scrambling to care for kids who are suddenly home for the foreseeable future.
The new reality of learning while staying safe.
For many parents with children still under the age of 5 or not yet eligible for a vaccine, normalcy still feels far away. And some of those youngsters have never even seen a world without COVID-19.
New reports showing how students are suffering setbacks across the country. Math test scores dropping dramatically in the wake of the pandemic.
Educators are facing increasing mental health needs. Now, Education Secretary Miguel Cardona told reporters that the report is an urgent call to action.
Yeah, Paul, I completely agree with you. So we're going to start off, we're going to hear from Chelsea. She's a mother with 2 young children. We're going to hear how her family had to cope and continues to navigate through COVID. Let's take a listen.
Hi, my name is Chelsea. My experience during the COVID-19 pandemic could be described as typical for a mother, a wife, and a professional. I endured the emotional roller coaster of those early days, fighting the crowds at the grocery stores, navigating uncomfortable conversations with my kids that suddenly weren't returning to school the next day, and trying to explain to them why we needed to wear a mask and protect some of our older family members. It was and continues to be a challenging time. When the pandemic first hit in 2020, my kids were 5 and 2 years old. As we worked to guide our family through the year, we entered into 2021, and it felt like a new normal. We had our routines and, we were getting through it. Unfortunately, that year, our family would experience an event that heightened our fears and frustrations that came with the pandemic. The Friday before Valentine's Day in 2021, our then 6-year-old daughter, her name's Callie, she woke up for school and she went downstairs to do her favorite little chore that she did every morning. She just got a new cat for Christmas. And at the time, we were using just a ceramic kitchen bowl for the cat's food that Callie would fill up each morning before she went to school. On that day, as the cat usually was, she was really excited and was kind of passing in between Callie's feet, just anxiously awaiting for her food. That caused her to trip over the cat, and she dropped the bowl that she was holding, and it shattered onto the hard floor, and Callie fell into that mess, and ceramic shards flew up into her face, and that resulted in a few cuts. So my husband and I, of course, ran downstairs, hearing all the commotion and the crying, and we quickly determined that we needed to get to the hospital because we were concerned that glass had gotten into her eye. Many hospital visits and experts later, they did find glass in her eye that was deep enough that it had done a lot of damage and really caused a snowball effect of issues. Callie had 6 different eye surgeries, in the beginning just to spare her eye, and then really to do everything possible to restore and improve her vision. As a mother and a spouse, I had emotions and feelings that I had never experienced before, and I'm a counselor by trade. I struggled to remain strong and calm in times where I was internally in a complete panic. Just watching my little daughter experience these terrifying tests and exams and then the surgeries. It was also peak COVID. This experience during a normal time would be so scary to a child, but now every doctor and nurse and child advocate, they had on at least one mask, if not a face shield, and all of their protective gear, and it was scary. She was in pain and going through a medical trauma, and that human connection of comfort and just reassurance were so difficult to feel, as oftentimes it didn't translate well when all you could see was somebody's eyes. When they were sitting there telling you that you were about to go through this really scary event and trying to make you understand that it was going to be okay and that they were in charge, and it was hard. Each of these experiences was intertwined with fear and protocols surrounding COVID. She had to have a COVID test before every surgery and oftentimes in between appointments. And that experience was oftentimes worse than surgery days. We all remember those early tests. They were super uncomfortable. And she knew in her little mind that getting a COVID test meant surgery soon and all of the scary feelings that came with it. I felt like I was holding my breath every time waiting for the results to come back, because what if she did have COVID? Would they still do the surgery? Would we have to stay in the hospital longer? What if my husband and I got COVID? As a spouse, I felt as though my husband and I kind of unconsciously took turns having emotional breakdowns. He would be strong and I would be sitting on the floor of the hospital room after they wheeled her away, just sobbing. Or I would be asking all these detailed questions to the medical team and he would just be a ghost in the corner of the room. We had moments of frustration where we'd have to give her 4 or 5 eye drops a day, and she would just outright refuse, just completely sick of it all. And we got it because we were also sick of all of it. Our 3-year-old son at the time would just unexpectedly be dropped off at his grandparents' house and left there for several days. And all he knew was that Sissy was at the doctor's. It was a lot. It was a lot for each of us individually and then also as a family unit. Fortunately, and I say this with the most gratitude I've ever felt, we made it. She's okay. Callie wears glasses and does have a decent amount of vision for that eye, all things considered. She is happy. She's bubbly. She is compassionate. Something we often say in our household is, we've made it through much worse. We can make it through this. You know, when trying times come or there's a sickness or, something doesn't go our way, we just look at each other and we say, we've made it through worse. We can make it through this. That year really taught us a lot about how to ask for help when we needed it, how incredible our family and our friends and church and community were. I don't think we would have made it through without them. It strengthened us as a family unit. We're still navigating. We still have hard days. We're still growing. We still have doctor's appointments. And unfortunately, COVID still continues to linger. But through it all, we learned that when things feel completely out of control and it feels like just the worst case scenario, there's a greater plan. We take a deep breath. We know we have this incredible village around us and it's going to be okay. Because we have each other, we know that it's going to be okay.
Wow, that was really powerful listening to that story. And although it was just specific to that family, so many families can relate. I'm looking forward to diving in and learning more about this topic. Paul, I understand you talked to Dr. Cruz. Can you tell us a little bit about her and her thoughts on ways we can all come back better from these experiences?
Yeah. Thanks, Marjorie. It was a fascinating conversation with Dr. Cruz, and she's a clinical psychologist with a broad and diverse clinical practice, providing psychotherapy as well as neuropsych testing to individuals, families, and groups of all ages. And I really found that she gave me a different take on the story and maybe even a little hope from it. Well, welcome, Dr. Cruz. Good to meet with you today. We both had the opportunity to listen to Chelsea, a mother, talking about her experience during the pandemic with her daughter. And I'm curious, what stood out for you in listening to Chelsea's experience?
Well, thanks so much for having me. And everybody had this constant balance and juggle of what are my family's priorities? What are the things that are most critical to us? In the best of times, as we were going through it and bringing those moments to it and where we grow, I think it really presented for folks that opportunity of what are the priorities for my family?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the things that maybe weren't as important to us as we thought, right? What are those things that we can say, this isn't worth that risk right now? That's a constant negotiation and all of that wear and that decision making. But we all were going through it together. And I think that was another area of community building. You reached out to another parent and said, hey, I think my kid has the sniffles and we can't come to this thing. People go, got it, understood.
Yeah, I'm hearing that, as parents, we do this all the time, but it made it really, there's an immediacy and a starkness to it. But also I appreciate the fact that none of us did this alone. We were all trying to figure it out together. And I do wonder, parents who maybe feel that they made different choices, whether it was around masking or how school happened at home, and this lingering sense of, did I make the right choices, or what are the long-term impacts? What do I need to do now? And if you can provide some guidance for us parents trying to navigate this, what would be the effects and what comes next as far as COVID?
The answer is, of course, we didn't do it exactly right.
That's reassuring.
There's zero chance that any of us did it exactly right.
Right.
And in our own way, that's modeling for our kids that that's okay too. As much as we can, listening to Chelsea's story, she had the routines for her kids. You're going to go down and you're going to feed the cat. Perfect. Gold star. It's like, that's what we were supposed to do. Give the kids more opportunities. We were supposed to give them ways to help around the house, have community, have family. We have the pet, we have the connection. And then this happens. It was one of my patients actually that shared this with me, that parenting is walking around with your heart outside your body.
Well said.
And every day send your kids out into this world. As parents, we have to find some way between bubble wrap and accepting this terribleness of not being able to control the world. I think one of the things we talk about the pandemic is this opportunity to develop grit and to develop resilience. You can't always calibrate that, though. You don't want the amount of grit that Chelsea's daughter had to go through. And that's not an amount you want to watch your kid get through. They did it in a beautiful way, right? Like they found ways and they learned coping strategies and they connected with their community and they were able to create this resilience building and stronger story out of it. And it is painful to watch your child go through that. Part of it is we can't change any of the decisions we've already made. That decision in that moment was because of the information we had, the skills we had, the resources we had, the coping strategies we had, all of those things at that moment. We're a different person now, but we weren't this person then. And so how do we really think about, as the person I am now, what can I do differently? How can I use this learned experience?
That really helps. I'm wondering, when you bring up that sense of heart walking around outside, there's a vulnerability to that. And I think it'd be helpful to understand this idea that while I may feel vulnerable as a parent, if you brought up resiliency and speak to how resilient our children may really be, even when I'm feeling vulnerable. Can you speak a bit to that?
We say it and it's true. Children are very resilient. When you see kids go through different experiences and developing that as an actual skill. So it's not that they're necessarily born resilient. You're not born with a certain amount of resilience points, and those exist as a stable characteristic throughout our life. Resiliency is a skill, and it's one you learn, and it's one you develop, and it's one that can be taught, and it's one that can be modeled. It also depends. There is an amount of stress that is too much. We need to develop and make sure that we don't rely on the resilience of kids. And sometimes we use that to okay the level of chronic stress that particularly children in marginalized and economically disadvantaged cultures. We say, well, kids are resilient, they'll be fine. But it does require that teaching and support and resource to be able to develop that resilience and to be able to use these challenges as opportunities to grow.
So resiliency is not enough into itself. It's resiliency plus parenting that really make the difference.
Absolutely. In parenting and access to needs, right?
Sure.
You have to be safe. You have to have food. You have to feel secure. And then also, like, once all of those things are in place, being able to look at your parents and say, hey, this is not her best day. But she is okay, right? And we have days as parents like that. Part of teaching your kids that is learning and managing it. And I think what was so challenging during the pandemic and how strapped all of the adults around our kids were. Nobody was feeling like they were on their A game. And kids in some way are kind of the canary in the coal mine because they rely on all these systems. They rely on schools, they rely on teachers, they rely on parents, they rely on grandparents, they rely on all of these systems of care and make no decisions independently. And so they are particularly vulnerable to that system and when it's not able to support. That, I think, is something we really saw in the pandemic, is how important it is that we take care of parents and teachers and medical providers who are all taking care of these kids, rather than hoping that the kids are resilient enough that if we all fall apart, they'll be okay.
Yeah, and I appreciate the fact that the message of self-care and systems care, that we're really caring for our children. That means we have an eye and awareness to all of that. As you said, we always talk about kids are resilient, but I want to make sure what does that mean? So when we talk about resiliency, what do you mean by that?
So, resiliency is the ability to bounce back, to deal with challenges when they come up, and to be able to carry on. You use it to become stronger and move through those challenging times. It is something that humans were good at. It's super important that children have that opportunity, that they have that opportunity to be challenged, to say, this is hard for me. And what do I do?
Okay.
I think what was super hard about this time is that the challenge level increased so dramatically, so quickly. That's not a pace that is helpful.
Right.
If you had an ideal resiliency, it's like, think about learning an instrument. You don't want to toss a big, complicated music thing in front of it and hand a kid a violin and say, go. You teach them in steps, and you take these moments and like little challenges in little ways all the way up until you have this complex skill.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I really think Dr. Cruz's comments about resiliency and parenting were spot on.
Yeah, and as we continue to talk about families and children of all ages, I do remember being concerned. Am I making good choices as a parent when it comes to things like school and switching to home and masks and social interactions? And, I think I'm not alone in that, of how many parents out there are wondering about, okay, we made the best choices we could, like Dr. Cruz said. And I had a chance to talk to Dr. Rogers as well about this topic of really taking to heart. We did the best we knew how to, and now what do we do moving forward?
I am excited to learn more.
Yes, let me tell you about Dr. Rogers. He's the medical director of Child and Adolescent Services at the Medical Center of Aurora. He's also the current president of the Colorado Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Society, and he sits on the advocacy committee for the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. As a place to begin, wondering about the impact of masking and social distancing, and how did that impact children emotionally, socially? What are we seeing?
Masks in particular, I think, are very different experiences for a young child versus an adolescent. With young children in particular, they find them almost intolerable a lot of times to wear themselves, and they can be very almost frightening to sort of see masks on everyone. And they led to lots of perceptions that everyone was going to get sick, everyone was wearing a mask. And so while they obviously were one of our best methods of keeping ourselves safe, they were almost a signal of danger to some of the younger kids, which I think was interesting from their perspective.
You mentioned about the education a bit, and I'm wondering, as far as the education experiences for children and adolescents, again, this was not planned. It was a quick pivot by our educational system. How the differences impacted learning both during and now as we're coming out of COVID.
Time will tell what the long-term impacts are. Certainly, I see those who, I'm surprised at how many kids dread going back to in-person. And many of them are the same ones that dreaded going to online. And people in general, teenagers included, they adapt to what they get used to. And we gave them just enough time to adapt to this virtual world. And then we put them back in this in-person world. And the challenges will continue. I don't have any data to suggest that academic achievement or grades as a whole or overall impacted. We still see the same gaps between kids with more socioeconomic resources doing well in school and those who do not, doing poorly in school. And that gap does appear to be widening recently, but hesitant to blame that entirely on the change in learning styles. But I do think it's, again, I'm an eternal optimist. It was nice for some kids to be able to excel in ways that maybe they would not have before. And kids that felt shy and couldn't maybe contribute in a classroom discussion as well felt like maybe they could flourish and blossom in their own way. In younger children, we saw more out of control behavior, more what we call externalizing disorders, where the problems are external. You can see kids acting out, you can see kids breaking rules. And that's quite understandable when you're a kid that needs to explore the world, and now the world has become your house. That's not particularly tenable. And then when parents are full-time teachers, parents, and disciplinarians, I think also a lot of people's bandwidth was really stretched. And so those needs were more pronounced in the younger kids. And again, that seemed to be cross-cultural, not just in America, but was more common in, certainly 11 and under, but 7 and under being the more common.
The other thing that was such a big deal and a big shift for us during COVID was the topic of nutrition and exercise. I mean, we all had to completely change our lifestyles, whether we went out to a gym or we went out to eat. Now, all of a sudden, we had to figure out how to exercise at home and eat healthy when we didn't have a lot of options. I mean, I know I struggled, but I can only imagine families with young kids. If you got working moms and working families that are used to picking up takeout on the way home or taking their kids out to eat because they didn't have time to cook, all of a sudden, all of that shut down. Getting groceries was tough. I mean, we just had so much fewer options around nutrition as a result of COVID.
Marjorie, you really got me thinking around the disruption and how all our routines went out the window. While that was challenging, there's opportunity here as well to maybe question some of those routines we had and around things like family nutrition and meals. Maybe we can learn from this.
Well, I had such an interesting conversation with Dr. Glasofer, which focused on nutrition and how that was impacted by the pandemic. Dr. Glasofer is amazing. She's an associate professor of clinical medical psychology in psychiatry at the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. She's also a clinical psychologist at the Columbia Center for Eating Disorders at the New York State Psychiatric Institute.
Yeah, I'm definitely game, Marjorie, for learning better choices and options here about food at home. So I can't wait to listen to Dr. Glasofer.
Dr. Glasofer, thank you so much for joining us today as we talk about young children and families.
Thank you so much for having me.
Not all families have the same resources. So what are some of the unique stressors that families from different socioeconomic and racial backgrounds might have experienced that could be impacting behaviors related to eating, exercise, and overall emotional wellness during and since COVID?
It's a really great question. I want to talk a little bit first about the element of socioeconomic status, and in particular, thinking about ways families might have been impacted if parents had to continue to go out to do an essential job kind of work. That may have added an element of stress for the entire family about what the risk of exposure to COVID might have been. We also know that many people in this country experience food insecurity. Money's really tight, and they're not sure if they're going to be able to put enough food on the table for their loved ones. Food insecurity in and of itself is known to be associated with, especially in adults, with sometimes experiencing loss of control when eating. And really, if you think about that, it can be in part because when people have the opportunity to eat, they may then try to, quote unquote, make the most of food that's out there. Whereas at other moments, because they don't know when they will have enough food. Also, the stress of not knowing whether you're going to be able to get enough nourishment for your family is linked with feeling anxious. It's linked with feeling depressed. It's a very stressful situation that folks are in. In terms of both socioeconomic status and racial stress, I think we have to acknowledge that there's been plenty of evidence that the actual illness of COVID-19 disproportionately seriously affected communities of color and communities with fewer resources. And so it's not just how was lifestyle impacted, was there enough money for this, that, and the other, but also that these are folks who may have had more loss, more people who got sick, and those kinds of stressors, which again, really are going to impact overall well-being. It paints a pretty grim picture of just how hard the peak of the pandemic was for some of our country's population.
I'm curious, have you heard from parents that young children are experiencing more eating disorders or unhealthy habits and behaviors as a result of COVID's impact?
There are a couple of themes. I think parents have been very challenged by how much or in what ways to rely on screens for their children. And I think that is connected with health behavior in a number of ways, because if a child is on a tablet, right, for hours of a day, those are hours that they're not outside playing, getting physical activity, for example. I've heard from parents that kids may be eating more because they're just at home and they're around the kitchen more, and there's sort of more, sometimes more food available and more snacking that's happening. On the other end of the spectrum, I've also heard from parents who are worried about kids kind of under eating, that they are kind of stressed out by what's going on, may need to be encouraged to eat enough food. There's a range of things I've heard from parents over these last couple of years.
What would you say are some of the common stressors for parents during COVID pertaining to food and exercise? And then what are some good nutritional and exercise habits and behaviors that some families have adopted during COVID that they should continue to do?
I think in terms of food, this was a time when we were all asked to really adapt. I've almost myself forgotten a little bit that in the initial weeks and months of this pandemic, most people were, if they went to the grocery store, not everything was fully stocked, right? Or they're waiting in long lines for food. Some people were ordering things to be delivered. There wasn't as much fluidity and flexibility and variety necessarily as there might otherwise have been, right? Like parents weren't going to take kids out for dinner, for example, or, stop by a favorite fast food restaurant. I think it was stressful, especially if you have a kid who's a little bit of a pickier eater, that flexibility was demanded, and that has some challenges. Now, for parents who had kids who kind of tend to overdo a little bit, who, really love all their snack foods, right? I think they had to walk a line of not being food police, right? But also trying to redirect kids so that they were eating and snacking appropriately, and then also doing their schoolwork or playing their games, or even being on a Zoom with other family members, and really having times where they were eating and they weren't eating, which would have been the case in the normal rhythm of life. In terms of some of the good habits I think families have adopted, there has been some research showing that overall, people really began cooking more meals together. Families were eating less fast food. Families were eating many of their meals together, which we know from a longstanding literature provides a time of connection between parents and children. And I think some of those new patterns that got laid down are pretty healthy and great, to really have shifted a little bit back from a culture that can lean too heavily on the convenience of eating out or ordering in, and returning more to a model of family cooking together, family eating together, kids having a chance to participate in those processes, including the cleaning up the table afterwards, doing chores, being a solid citizen in the household. There's so many things kids can learn when a family prepares, eats, and cleans up together.
This has been so informative and so helpful. Thank you so much, Dr. Glasofer, for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was really helpful, listening to Dr. Glasofer. And, my takeaway is there's an opportunity here to make mealtime family time, and including even the cooking as well as the eating together. And I really feel a commitment to, I'm going to go home and play and practice with this with the family.
It's so true. Remember, there was that craze where everybody was making sourdough bread, and you couldn't get yeast anywhere.
I did not, but yeah.
I mean, it's really amazing to think about how you're absolutely right. We had to make that pivot, and now all of a sudden it's like, so what are we going to have for dinner tonight? What are our options?
Right.
So I think it's really interesting.
As the dad of a special needs kiddo, Even before COVID, I'm always questioning, am I making the right choices? Can I be doing better? I feel a bit reassured listening to these experts that, as parents, we do the best we can with the knowledge at hand. And there's still opportunity to learn and do better the next day.
I 100% agree. I think just this whole notion about resiliency is so critical, right? Because we just never know what's right ahead of us. We don't know that, okay, now we're in a new normal, but who knows what could happen that could set us backwards to something like this again.
Right.
And knowing that we have it within us to stop and recreate, I think there's different kinds of people, and some of us feel sorry for ourselves and we get stuck, or we just say, okay, it's a new normal and let's got to figure out how to make it happen. People figured out exercise routines at home and, new ways to cook and new ways to parent and playing games and puzzles and binge watching shows and all kinds of things like that. And I hope that there are pieces of that we get to carry with us always, which is really about the quality of life. I think there's a lot there.
Marjorie, thank you. This has been such a wonderful opportunity to chat with you and learn from our experts about what we can glean from families and COVID. And we're just getting started. Next time, we're going to be talking about changes at work. So the other area of our lives that was completely thrown on its side. And I can't wait to hear more about your experience as CEO and the decision and challenges to go from on-site working to everyone being at home virtually.
I'm really looking forward to that conversation too. There's so much that we all dealt with, and I love this series, and each one of these episodes they get so interesting.
If you'd like to reach us, you can do so at podcast@psychhub.com. To be notified of new episodes, don't forget to like, subscribe, or follow wherever you're listening. And reviews are so helpful, so please do leave one if you can. It'll allow others to find us and join along. Coming Back Better is executive produced by Jacob Morrison. It is produced and edited by Juliana Castro. The series was developed in collaboration with Linda Rosenberg, Carla Cantor, and Kristen Watson from Columbia University Department of Psychiatry, and Manisha Shah, Dr. Frank Drummond, and Amy Rushton from HCA Healthcare. Research is assisted by Melissa Leaf. Show artwork was created by Arnella Jangoli and Ashton Smith. Audience strategy is by Alyssa Fackler, Sarah Hale, and Alyssa Yarama. A very special thanks to Andrea Rollback, Trevin Stegall, Evelyn Valentine, Kaylee Sneed, Julie Plummer, Thad Thomas, and Elizabeth Roosevelt. Coming Back Better is a co-production from Psych Hub and Columbia University Department of Psychiatry and is brought to you by HCA Healthcare. I'm Paul Deger, and my co-host Marjorie Morrison and I thank you for joining us. See you next week.